I'm James Brining, I'm the Artistic Director of Dundee Rep. When you're working on a show with a designer, you're trying to create a world for the events of the play to take place in. So it's quite an early conversation in the process before you get the actors in and start the rehearsal process. There are some processes that are much more integral, that you create that as part of the rehearsal, but for a show like Sweeney Todd, for any big show, you need to have quite strong parameters within which you're working. And every director and designer works differently. The way that I tend to do it is to obviously read and know the play quite well, as does the designer, and then to come together and have a conversation about what interests you and what excites you about the piece in particular. It's really a question is, how are we going to tell this story? What kind of languages will we use in the telling of the story? Visual languages. Whether there will be, whether the show will be naturalistic, whether there will be props that are the actual things people are talking about, whether it will be quite a literal representation, or whether it's more fluid and more theatrical. Sweeney Todd, for me, it's about a number of different things. It's very rich thematically, and there's some big. I'll just chuck some big words out. It's about obsession. It's about oppression. It's about love and madness. It's about injustice and hypocrisy, and it's also about capitalism to some extent. It seems to be about a man. It's about a man called Sweeney Todd, who, according to legend, killed a huge number of people, over 100, nearly 160 people apparently. But I think what Stephen Sondheim has done with the legend of Sweeney Todd is not just about Sweeney Todd. It's actually about a society as much as a man. And in that respect, I think the musical is a very political piece of theatre. It looks at the consequences of a society which is essentially imbalanced and unfair, in which you've got a huge gap between people who have things and people who haven't things. And about people who are able to make things happen literally with a kind of flick, and people and the consequences for people who are dealing with that kind of careless abuse of power. So it's a pretty meaty piece, but it also stylistically has a lightness and an energy that should for me make it emotionally very, very engaging, and at times funny as well. We're still in the process of finalising design, so it may be that the final show is different from this, but at the minute we're very much thinking about the late 70s, early 80s in Britain, which was politically a time when there was a certain amount of tension within the country. There were a lot of strikes, there were riots in the early 80s across Britain, but particularly in London. A time of, in a way, the renaissance of, or the rebirth of, a capitalist ideal, and it was just before the Big Bang happened in the city of London. So it's pre-mobile phones, it's pre things that you would recognise as contemporary, but it is a time when Britain was kind of creaking a little bit, and it feels to me that that time resonates with the time that Sondheim has set Sweeney Todd. The costumes have to tell the right story, and have to resonate in tune with when we're setting it. But because it's in the 70s and 80s, late 70s, early 80s, it isn't going to be leg warmers and blue eye makeup and bubble perms. It isn't going to be that kind of... it's not going to be like watching an episode of Life on Mars where you're spotting the 80s references. I'm not particularly interested in that. I'm more interested in evoking a time and a place. And that's what the costume has to do, whilst also delivering a sense of coherence visually through the world of the play. So use of colour, for instance, would be a crucial thing. The use of red, I would imagine, because there's a lot of blood in this play, and black and white. It's about contrast. But it's quite difficult to say at this point exactly what it's going to be. In terms of the actual stage set, you can do a play in which the mechanics are invisible, in which things fly in, come on, you don't see how that happens, it just kind of flows, you have scene changes and the scene's different. I'm not that interested in that for this play, because I think that what this play has, what this musical has, that the source play it draws on doesn't have, is a chorus. So there's a chorus of people within this world who sing quite a lot and who play different groups of people within the play. And for me, the trick is to work out who the chorus are, because the chorus are the people that start and finish the play, and the chorus are the ones who say at the beginning, "Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd." So they're saying to the audience, listen to this story. So we have to discover why they're saying that and who they are. And I think if you can discover that and create a world in which that makes some sort of sense, then you've got a whole other layer of experience going on than just, this is the story of Sweeney Todd and Mrs Lovett and the judge that he kills. What you often end up doing in a show like this is that you have a base costume, which means a basic under costume that you change elements of. So maybe the shoes and the trousers stay pretty much the same, and the shirt, but then you have a coat which comes on, and that can give a sense of fluidity. For a character like Sweeney or Mrs Lovett probably would have a number of different costumes. People in the chorus who then are playing parts and going back to being chorus would definitely have that base costume onto which elements are added. And that can make your budget go a lot further, but it also keeps a sense of unity as well. So it isn't just like completely different one scene into another scene. It keeps a sense of coherence, visual coherence, which is really important. That otherwise the thing just feels like as chaotic as if you walked out the door and looked at what people were wearing. It would have complete, you'd see trends, but there wouldn't be any real particular relationship. Not unless you were going to a football match and everybody was wearing the same scarf. In a show like this, you need to make sure there's a coherence visually within the world, because you want to tell a story which has that kind of impact. And a base costume is a very useful way of ensuring that's the case. It's hard to sum up Sweeney Todd in a sentence. It's maybe easier to use a number of words about him. So I would say that he is damaged, brutal, vulnerable, obsessive, and a psychopath. I'd say that's what he is. And those words, I think, maybe they're not actually contradictory, but the vulnerable and the brutal feel like they're paradoxical. But actually I think the vulnerability of him is related to his brutality, is related to his psychopathology. His purpose and role in the show is it's called Sweeney Todd, so there is no show without Sweeney. And it's a show about a man who commits mass murder. But what this particular musical does is explore some of the reasons why that happens. So what you have to try and do is get the audience to empathise with him, understand him, and ultimately be appalled by what he does. And I think if you can do that, then the audience can be kind of lured into what he does and understand rationally why he does it. Mrs Lovett is the woman who runs a pie shop, and before Sweeney Todd gets transported to Australia, he's got a barber shop which is upstairs from her pie shop. So they sort of have known each other, and it turns out in the course of the play that Mrs Lovett has been married, that her husband has died, and she's basically a widow running this pie shop with no money. She's not selling any pies. As she says in the play, the pies are absolutely disgusting. And Todd comes back trying to find out what's happened to his wife and child, and she knows what's happened to his wife and child, and she tells him this, and she encourages him to start what he did before, which is to be a barber and to open up the shop above the pie shop, the barber shop, and to basically live with her. And that's what happens. He is obsessed with avenging the injustice that's been done to him. She's less worried about that. She's actually like, oh, just forget about it, dear. She's completely in love with him. But when it's obvious that he's not going to let that go, she then, in the typical Mrs Lovett fashion, pragmatically decides that rather than just dispose of bodies people that he's killed, why not utilise the flesh of those bodies? So that's how they end up making meat pies and selling them. That sounds horrendous, but she introduces in the play some lightness and some humour and also some pathos, I think. So she is funny. She's sort of outrageous and flirtatious, and I think the audience can't help but like her, even as they're analysing. If they're analysing what she's doing, they're also appalled by her. So that's her function in the play, I think, is to be the Lady Macbeth to his Macbeth.